Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40k lore video. This will be the last video in the Second War for Armageddon series. And yet, I have 2 episodes left to do, including this one. How mysterious. Anyways, to return to the point, Gasguls Thrakas Invasion would appear to have failed. Gasguls Thrakas' main attempt against the Hive of Hellsreach had failed. His surprise assault on that very same hive had also failed. Furthermore, his attempts at crossing the rivers Diabolus and Styges had met with equal failure. And with the recent destruction of the Mannerheim Gap Argent yards, the Orcs had lost access to some of their heaviest equipment on the planet of Armageddon. Gasguls Thraka had bet everything on one single titanic blow. It was expected to take over half of the planet's hives in one single strike. It was expected to take Hellsreach, Deathmire, Volcanus, Tempestora, Acheron, and of course the destruction of Hades. This would have secured the Orcs an overwhelming foothold on Armageddon Secundus, and allowed them to wipe out the less numerous hives on Prime without much resistance. Additionally, Orc forces had landed both to the north and the south, on the extreme ends of the continent. This was a move meant to seize control of Armageddon's primary sources of promethium. The drilling platforms out to sea would be destroyed by the submersible fleet created by Archimedes. The destruction of the platforms were achieved, however the Orcs were not capable of taking control over the drilling platforms to the extreme north and south, which meant that the vital promethium kept flowing into Armageddon Prime and Secundus, and after that straight into the Imperium's war engines. Overall, the Beast of Armageddon succeeded with half of his plan. Key elements included the surprise attack against Hive Volcanus, which almost toppled the Hive, the successful infiltration efforts against Acheron, and of course the surprise submersible assault on Tempestora. However, without control over Hive Hellsreach, the main docking districts and naval trade routes of Armageddon remained operational. And with the dismal failure of the surprise assault against Hive Deathmire, the Orcs were unable to separate Hive Hellsreach from reinforcements. They were also unable to separate the Imperial forces that were sent to defend the rivers Diabolus and Styges. Instead, forces of various Astartes chapters, including of course the ever-vaunted and valorous Salamanders, managed to hold these rivers against overwhelming Orc numbers. The Orc Blitz had been stopped, checked, and eventually shattered upon the Imperium's shield. That is not to say that the Orcs did not have considerable forces still on Armageddon Prime. In fact, the battle would last long after the successful defense of Hellsreach and the destruction of the Argent yards at the Mannerheim Gap. However, after these setbacks, it became increasingly clear that the war on Armageddon would devolve into a stalemate. This was partially due to the fact that the Orcs could no longer bring in substantial reinforcements for a final push from outside the system. Now that they no longer had Gasguls' direct guidance, the massive Orc fleet had begun to splinter apart and become ever more scattered and disfocused. This allowed Admiral Parole and the newly arrived Astartes elements to continue to pick apart the Orc fleet. This would eventually allow the Imperium to reposition vast numbers of men and material via orbital drops. It would also allow the Astartes to regain their superiority of movement by allowing them to retreat back to their ships in orbit and launch rapid hit-and-run operations via drop pods and Thunderhawks at any Orc armies on the move. This fact would also probably have weighed heavily upon Gasgul's mind. He knew that the Emperor's Angels were very fond of attempting to decapitate anyone trying to play with them. As such, if the Emperor's Astartes were allowed to regain space superiority, in all due likelihood they would be coming for Gasgul very quickly. At the same time, retreating to orbit and taking back control over the Void War was not truly an option. The Orcs had won that engagement by overwhelming their Imperial opposition with sheer numbers, and driving a hammer blow straight towards the planet of Armageddon. Again, the Great Beast had bet everything on one single hammer blow. He was to take Armageddon in a blitz assault. This was why he did not stop to take out the various dockyards in system on the way to Armageddon. He did conduct some minor raid against the Forge Worlds of Voss, for example, but overall this had a relatively minor effect on the Imperial fleet's resupply situation. This allowed damaged ship to retreat and repair themselves. This also allowed the Imperial Navy to continuously launch brutal assaults upon the Orc invaders, depleting virtually all of their ammunition, safe in the knowledge that they could withdraw, resupply, and rearm. At this point in time, the Orc fleet was simply too scattered and too depleted to have any chance to beat the Imperial Navy in a straight-up engagement, which it had to commit to at this point in time, since they would have had to dedicate themselves to a massed assault upon the Imperial Navy's resupply stations. Anything else would eventually have seen the Orc fleet picked apart, and the Imperium, of course, were constantly receiving reinforcements, while the Orcs could not. Any Orc fleets that translated into system at this point would be intercepted, sectioned off, and destroyed weeks before they arrived on Armageddon. Additionally, Gasgul no longer possessed the manpower, or in this case Orc power, necessary to launch another decisive blow against the Imperial Guard and Astartes forces on Armageddon itself. With the destruction of the Argent Yard at the Mannerheim Gap, an action that the Celestial Lines were primarily responsible for, or at the very least in spirit, he could no longer reinforce his warbands with the god machines of the Orcs. To make matters even worse, Gasgul had brought a relatively small number of these machines to Armageddon. And again, we are talking about the Mega Gargant classes here, not the regular Gargants, which were available in vast quantities. As Mega Gargants were concerned, however, the Imperium had more war machines of an equal weight and power. Additionally, the Imperial war machines were considerably better suited to fighting over the open areas of Armageddon, which the Orcs now found themselves corralled in. And again, with the loss of the Gargant yards, they could no longer repair existing Gargants, they could no longer upgrade normal Gargants to Mega Gargants, and they could no longer produce new Gargants in substantial quantities. This meant that in every single engagement from this point onwards, the Imperium would slowly but surely be able to increase its superiority in firepower, which in return would decrease the Orcs' abilities to produce more heavy weapons, as slowly but surely Armageddon's lost industrial centers would switch back to Imperial control. And once again, to compound the issues, Gasgul had not managed to secure as much of the planet's manufacturing capabilities as he had originally intended. In fact, he was at least one hive short. He had expected to take over Hive Deathmire as well via a surprise attack. This surprise attack turned out to be a complete and utter failure, as the entire Blackfire tribe responsible for the attack was wiped out in the open by Imperial Titans. This left only the relatively intact hives of Acheron and Tempestora to fuel his war effort. The rest of the hives were either too badly damaged to truly contribute to the war effort, or simply just outright destroyed like Hades. But the Orcs would of course not have needed to engage in a long-term war if Gasgul's final and perhaps bolder stratagem had paid off: the deployment of the Orc Rocks. Gasguls' hope was that the Imperium would sally out from its fortifications to retake the hives that had fallen to surprise attacks and infiltration, essentially meeting the orcs in the open fields. However, the Imperium had tried just this tactic during the First War for Armageddon, and it had bitten them in the ass like a cybernetically enhanced great white shark. They were not about to make the same mistake again. As such, Gasgul was not able to separate and isolate these Imperial Guard regiments in the open by dropping rocks directly on their retreat paths. Only in the case of a localized counterattack near Hive Volcanus were the orcs able to shear off a substantial portion of the Imperial Guard forces and destroy them, with the destruction of an entire regiment of Sevlar Chemdogs. But considering this stratagem was intended to entirely destroy entire Imperial armies, this was also yet another in a long line of critical failures. The Beast of Armageddon had played a very, very high-stakes game and had come very close to winning as well. However, it was just not enough. In their current position, the orcs did not have enough strength to launch another major offensive on Armageddon. They did not have the industrial capabilities to rebuild their army, and as such, they now found themselves in a position where at best they could engage in a long-term war of attrition with the Imperium. A war that in all due likelihood they had no chance of winning. I do suspect, though, that this was not merely Gasgul betting everything on one card. I suspect there is a certain level of cold calculation behind this seemingly reckless decision. As we saw in The Void, the moment Gasgul Mag Uruk Thraka surrendered direct control over the Orc Navy, everything started to fall apart really, really quickly. I suspect that Gasgul figured that he needed to defeat the Imperium in one quick and decisive strike, otherwise he would eventually start losing direct control over his orc horde, and considering the sheer amount of orcs in system and the sheer amount of rivals in system, this would inevitably lead to chaos, and in all due likelihood it might also lead to some other warlord getting ideas above his station. In short, the sheer size of Gasgul's horde proved, at least in part, to be his undoing. In the early months, when everyone was following his plan, they had great success, although even then, it turned out that some of Gasgul's schemes were a little bit too advanced for their own good. For example, the surprise attack on Hive Deathmire. This might have worked out again if it were not for the rather boisterous nature of the orcs. Gasgul had overestimated his horde's capability to move silently. The surprise attack against Volcanus was achieved mostly due to the fact that the troops were landed nearby. But on the other hand, he also pulled off some truly impressive pieces of strategy. The infiltration assault and complete takeover of Acheron, for example, was an absolute masterstroke. An entire hive neutralized in a single night, with barely a shot being fired. Gasgul had secured himself the entire industrial output of an entire Imperial hive immediately, and undamaged. Truly, that was quite the achievement. And make no mistake, this was no slapdash operation. Again, I remind you, this is an entire Imperial hive, with a garrison and of course its own Adeptus Arbites forces. This was a masterfully executed, multi-pronged assault. The hive's leadership was decapitated by infiltrators. The Adeptus Arbites were overwhelmed by infiltrating orc commandos and bully boys. The garrisons were cut off from their barracks and supply depots again by cleverly deployed units of orcs. Not to mention, Gasgul did not merely just have a plan to take the hive, he also had a plan to keep it. And make no mistake, Hermann von Straub was not a popular individual in Hive Acheron. No doubt his replacement of the old regime would have been deeply unpopular. which means that Gasgul managed to replace the Adeptus Arbites as a peacekeeping force, peace, quote-unquote, in the terms of orcs here, within weeks, which in and of itself is quite the achievement. Not to mention, of course, that he essentially directed a planet-wide invasion that struck against multiple targets in a matter of weeks. That is downright incredible. We are talking millions upon millions of orcs, hundreds of disparaging tribes, dozens and probably even hundreds of warlords, and dozens of rooks, all under their own separate command structures, needing to be deployed very, very carefully. This was an achievement worthy of any Imperial strategist. Indeed, I might even go so far as to say that if the Great Beast of Armageddon can be accused of any major strategic blunder, it is in underestimating the stubbornness of Armageddon's defenders. Time and time again, they fought to the absolute bitter end, selling their lives as dearly as humanly possible in the face of an overwhelming orc horde. The Imperial defenders would retreat step by bloody step, while completely and utterly decimating their own hives and manufactorums, leaving nothing for the orc invader. All in all, it was not a bad strategy by any stretch of the imagination. However, it must also be recognized that it hinged entirely upon Gasgul's ability to take Armageddon Secundus within the first 6 months of the landing. This would give him the industrial and strategic position necessary to sweep into the lesser defended Armageddon Prime and secure control over the planet long before the Imperial Navy was capable of breaking the blockade in the void. In this assumption, however, Gasgul was to be proven overly optimistic. Over the course of several months of brutal fighting, the Imperium had bent, but not broken, and at the end of these starting months, the Imperium still stood defiant of the Greenskin invader. It had taken Gasgul too long. The season of fire was once again upon Armageddon, making any further orc offensives pointless. Finally, recognizing this fact, Gasgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the Great Beast of Armageddon, admitted defeat and fled the planet before the Imperium could gather significant forces to destroy his fleet in orbit and blockade the planet below. The exact timing of the Beast's exit is not entirely clear. Some suggest it was a little bit before the destruction of the Gargant Yards at the Mannerheim Gap. Others have suggested that this was merely a ruse by the Beast, and that he had attempted to draw forces away from Armageddon in the pursuit of some proxy. What we do know for sure is that the Beast of Armageddon has left the planet. These days, the Imperial defenders that remain primarily busy themselves by hunting down various and scattered orc warbands that still roam the planet, destroying the remaining holdfasts and trying to prevent them from breaking out and into the equatorial jungle, as it has proven to be an absolute nightmare to try and cleanse the jungle of its green-skinned inhabitants. Do not get me wrong, however, the orcs still have a considerable presence on Armageddon. The war has been won, quote-unquote, but the struggle is far from over. Orcs do not roll over and surrender meekly. As for the planet itself, it has taken quite a battering, and Armageddon's fate remains unclear. Armageddon's privileged position within the Imperium of deserving to be defended by such a large force is primarily because it used to be, and I say used to be, an extremely important industrial hub. However, after suffering the ravages of the Greenskin horde, much of that industry now lies in ruin. Some within the Imperium at large have even suggested that the planet is no longer worth defending, and is advocating for a full-scale withdrawal from Armageddon. Others are suggesting slightly less drastic measures, but they are still potentially damning for the planet, like, for example, seizing the constant supply of reinforcements to the planet. As I mentioned, Armageddon is still fighting a fairly ferocious conflict to deal with the remaining greenskins on the planet. The Adeptus Astartes have long since left the planet behind, except for a few companies of salamanders, as the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes are too valuable to be wasted on what is essentially a cleaning up operation. Others have suggested that perhaps Armageddon should not be receiving the full power of the Imperium's backing when it comes to rebuilding itself. They are suggesting that perhaps the planet simply will never regain its previous position as an economic and industrial powerhouse, and as such, it is best to cut the Imperium's losses now. And perhaps, in the far future, many centuries quite possibly, the planet may once again regain its stature within the Imperium and be worthy again of the wider Imperium's aid. Unless, of course, the Beast returns first. And as for the Imperial defenders, it is hard to come up with any kind of solid numbers for casualties. We do know that the civilian casualties stretch easily into the billions. The destruction of Hades' hive alone would probably have cost upwards of 10 billion human lives. As Yarrick, of course, prioritized the military evacuation of the hive rather than the civilian. Additionally, war with all of its horror is never kind to the civilian population. Infrastructure is destroyed, granaries emptied to feed the ravenous imperial armies needed to defend them, water lines broken apart, and of course the simple fact that Armageddon is not, at the best of times, a particularly friendly planet. Something so relatively minor as a breakdown in, for example, the cooling systems of a hive might lead to thousands, if not tens of thousands of people choking to death as the season of fire fills the halls of the hive with choking ash and brimstone. Tens of thousands more, if not hundreds or millions, might die as water sources are contaminated or interrupted entirely. And of course there is the ever-present question of food. Armageddon is, as you might expect, not an agri-world. It expects and depends upon the wider Imperium to provide it with food. In return, it provides the wider Imperium with its industrial might. With that industrial potential in ruins, the food supplies are looking extremely dicey. Billions might simply just starve to death as the planet no longer receives enough food. And of course, as with any civilian population that is asked to undergo these hardships, there will be riots. There will be public actions against the Imperial authority. There will be cries of outrage, and there will be the inevitable Adeptus Arbites response. And even if Armageddon is able to rise once again from the ashes, it will likely never be quite the same planet ever again. As for the Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Astartes, again, we cannot really come up with any kind of firm casualty numbers. The Imperial Guard's numbers undoubtedly stretch into the millions. For example, we know that Hellstreet alone probably accounted for a couple million Imperial Guard casualties. Amongst the Adeptus Astartes, the casualty rate undoubtedly would have been considerably lower, but there were also cases of casualties stretching well and truly into uncomfortable ranges, as was, for example, the case of the poor Celestial Lions. The Flesh Tearers, as well, were reduced to such a size that they were considered to be combat ineffective at the end of the War for Armageddon. But in my opinion, far more important than the casualty numbers is how the Imperium fared under the threat of Gasgul Mag-Uruk Thraka. We know, for example, that there were over 16,000 Adeptus Astartes on Armageddon. This is a Great Crusade era level of Astartes. In fact, the forces present on Armageddon would be the equal of a little over 1.5 full companies of Adeptus Legiones. This is an incredibly powerful fighting force, which in all due likelihood could potentially have defended Armageddon by themselves during the age of the Great Crusade. However, it swiftly became apparent that these were not the legions of old. There were over 18 chapters present on Armageddon. Practically all of them had considerable differences in how they waged war. Almost all, again, had vastly varying traditions, and even, in some cases, morals, ethics, and sense of value. One of the best examples that we can see from the War for Armageddon here is one particular incident that involved the Salamanders and their chapter master, Tushan. The Orcs had apparently managed to make their way into a refugee camp and taken hostages. The closest formation of Adeptus Astartes were the Marines Malevolent, and just let me pause on that name for a moment. Somebody over at Games Workshop figured to themselves, you know that Tushan guy? Yeah, you know, the black one. We need some way to make him more of a hero. We've already emphasized how the Salamanders are really good guys and help the civilian population, and we've already licked his salty ballsack massively during the first War of Armageddon by having him being singled out for honor by Dante himself, but I feel like he isn't quite as big of a hero as we should have made him. So, how about we have an Adeptus Astartes chapter just randomly artillery strike a refugee camp, and we have Tushan just go over there and bitch slap him. And the other guy over at GW went, yeah, that sounds like a fantastic idea. That's suitably douchebaggy of them, and suitably friendly of Tushan. That's perfect, but who are we going to get to bombard the refugees? We can't have the Ultra Smurfs doing it, or the Blood Angels, and we've already made the Flesh Tearers the bad guy of another engagement, so we can't use them again. And the first guy went, oh, that's easy. We'll just invent a new chapter, and we'll call them the Marines of Evil. And the second guy figured that was a little bit too obvious, so they decided on the Marines Malevolent instead, because that is basically the Marines Evil, except slightly more verbose. But hey, at least they look cooler than the Neko Neko Nyan chapter of the Meowstartes, so that's something. Anyways, the Marines of unadulterated evil and puppy-kicking launched artillery attack against the encampment, with the predictable consequence that the vast majority of the Orcs and refugees were turned into extra chunky salsa. Tushan then bitch-slapped the chapter master of the Marines Malevolent, and continued to virtue signal for a little bit. Okay, it was a little bit more serious than that. He had just launched an artillery strike on a civilian encampment, but that, in all due reality, was mostly just because they figured the civvies weren't really that important. I mean, they're civilians. They didn't manage to hold off the Orcs by themselves. Surely they should be more than happy to keep the Orcs occupied while the Emperor's angels took care of the green-skin threat. And hell, this isn't even all that uncommon of an idea amongst the Adeptus Astartes. The Black Templars, for example, view civilians as little more than battlefield debris, to be avoided and circumnavigated whenever possible, but if they are silly enough to actually get in the way, well, we invented the concept of collateral damage for a reason. And indeed, the God Emperor's chosen cranky pants, Grim Old Darkus, almost got into fisticuffs with the Salamander captain, because he was prioritizing aiding the civilians instead of helping out the Black Templars. And granted, this is Grimaldus we're talking about here. He's not the most understanding or fluffy of individuals at the best of times, but he was completely and utterly confused by the actions of the Salamanders. To give you the example, the Black Templars were launching hit-and-run assault against the Orcs, striking them quickly and violently, then melting back into Hive Hellsreach to launch further attacks. They didn't really give a shit about protecting the civilian population or aiding the evacuation in any way, shape, or form. They simply concentrated on doing as much damage to the Orcs as possible while minimizing the danger to themselves, so they could happily go on purging and smashing greenskins for as long as possible. The Salamanders, on the other hand, went out of their way to locate refugee columns and protect them and escort them all the way back to safety. This of course meant that they exposed themselves to considerably larger numbers of orcs, as the Space Marines would be able to move very, very quickly, even through the broken hive, whereas civilians would undoubtedly slow them down rather considerably. As far as Grimaldus was concerned, this was the Salamanders taking unnecessary casualties by escorting useless battlefield detriant. And what made it worse was that the Salamanders requested the aid of the Black Templars, tying them also to these useless hunks of flesh. In short, the Astartes were divided. And indeed, I might even go so far as to say that with this many different chapters in theatre at once, they were occasionally working directly against one another, as there was practically no chapter-to-chapter communication. One chapter of Astartes might launch an attack on what used to be a large concentration of orcs, only to realize that another chapter had already attacked that formation. There would be a lot of double action, where various chapters would be doing exactly the same thing and often getting in each other's way, to the point where eventually the Salamanders almost entirely withdrew from active combat operations to help the civilian population, even dedicating most of their tech priests to restoring the Hive's infrastructure rather than be used in offensive operations. Additionally, Armageddon High Command now had to deal with the fact that 16,000 superhumans were running wild across the planet, launching attacks willy-nilly here and there, hit and running, screaming around the place, and nobody really knew where or how many there were of them. So now Imperial Guard commanders had to work around the idea that a bunch of rabid superhuman zealots were wandering around the battlefield doing God only knows what. And don't get me wrong, the Astartes were very, very effective at what they did. They undoubtedly reaped one hell of a tally of orcs, and without the Black Templars and the Salamanders, Hell's Reach would almost certainly have fallen. But they would undoubtedly have been much, much more effective if they were actually a unified legion formation. Indeed, I might even go so far as to say that they probably would have been able to win the war by themselves if they were a conventional legion force. The orcs would have had a very, very hard time stopping a concentrated spearhead of 10,000 odd Astartes heading straight for the largest center of enemy resistance, where Gasgul was likely to be hiding. There was also plenty of friction between the Astartes and the various other Imperial elements. For example, we have one particularly nasty story told by the Sisters of the Argent Shroud. 3 companies of Battle Sisters were engaged in the defense of a small mining outpost. The remaining citizens of the mining outpost had organized into ad hoc militia units and had been armed with whatever was at hand. Eventually, the Sisters of the Argent Shroud made contact with an unknown number of flesh tearers commanded by their chapter master, Gabriel Seth. The chapter master denied any communication with the Sisters, denying any sharing of tactical data or even just base communication other than making themselves known in the area. Once the orcs engaged their final assault upon the mining colony, the flesh tearers fell upon them from the rear. The orcs were now trapped between the deadly accurate bolter fire of the Sisters of the Argent Shroud and the blood-maddened flesh tearers cutting through their rear ranks, with predictable consequences. The battle was turning into an absolute slaughter for the Greenskins. But Greenskins do not give up easily. A few mobs organized for one last-ditch attempt and headed for the ad hoc militia instead of the Sisters of Battle. The Flesh Tearers sent off a detachment to chase them down, and just as the orcs contacted the militia, the Flesh Tearers impacted upon the orcs' rearward lines. The Flesh Tearers ripped through the orcs as if they were paper. But once they hit the militia, the Flesh Tearers did not stop. The Sisters of the Argent Shroud were left to stand as helpless witnesses to the Flesh Tearers, many of which had ripped off their helmets, were now tearing into the ad hoc militia, ripping them apart with their bare hands and even occasionally their very teeth, ripping out their throats and reveling in the bloodletting. One sister superior of the Argent Shroud even reported to her canoness that she had witnessed acts of cannibalism being carried out by the flesh-tearers. In the end, the mining settlement was wiped out to the last man, woman, and child, not by the orcs, but by the supposedly loyalist chapter of the flesh-tearers. The incident was reported by the canoness to the Inquisition, but so far no action has been taken against the flesh-tearers chapter. To be entirely honest, the flesh-tearers do have their own circumstances, but to see them deployed in as heavily populated location as Armageddon does not strike me as a particularly good idea. The flesh-tearers are, as ever, balancing on a razor's edge between loyalty and utter and complete batshit insanity. Any Imperial commander worth his salt would try to ensure that if he is going to be employing the flesh-tearers, he had best make damn sure that his own gold braid-covered ass is at a considerable distance from any location in which they might be deployed. And if he is feeling particularly generous, perhaps he will even attempt to keep them away from the civilian population. But of course, the Adeptus Astartes were not the only ones that had some serious goddamn problems on Armageddon. For example, one of the reasons why Hellsreach managed to actually remain standing in the face of the Orc invader was the presence of a formation of Imperial Titans. These Titans were originally promised to the defense of Hellsreach and had been positioned at Hellsreach. However, it was only after Grimaldus beat some sense into their Principe Superior that the Titan Legion actually decided to stay where they were supposed to stay. Otherwise, they would have wandered off to join their brothers fighting along the Salamanders, way far to the north of Hive Hellsreach. If this had happened, the Hive would almost certainly have been lost. Additionally, if Grimaldus had not sent one of his tech marines to resurrect the ancient weapon Ordinatus Armageddon again, Hellsreach would almost certainly have been lost, if not completely destroyed, by the Orc Mega Gargant that had just finished wiping out the remainder of Hive Hellsreach Titan defenders. And of course, there is the exceedingly wasteful actions of the Inquisition carried out against the Celestial Lions chapter. The Lions had got on the bad side of the Inquisition by constantly bitching at them. Not the wisest of maneuvers, considering the near-infinite power of the Inquisition, and the Inquisition had finally decided to bitch back, and they did so with bullets, lasguns, bombs, and sabotage, in the best inquisitorial fashion. This led to the almost complete annihilation of the Celestial Lions chapter. It is unknown exactly how many Lions were left after the War for Armageddon, but considering their losses in the final assault, it is likely that there is going to be no more than 50, and perhaps as few as 20-odd remaining. And as mentioned, these acts of sabotage took place long before the battle was ever even remotely close to being won. The Celestial Lions were reduced from full chapter strength to less than 100 battle brothers, not due to attrition, but due to the interference of the Inquisition during one of the largest Orc invasions in the Imperium's history. Seems like the wrong time to be settling scores as far as I'm concerned. And finally, to sum it all up, Armageddon had held out against the Orc invasion. Gasguls Mag Uruk Thraka had been defeated. Most of his army had been destroyed, and it does not appear as if the planet is likely to fall any time soon, although it is still probably going to be a good decade before the Orcs are properly and thoroughly defeated. Unfortunately for the Imperium, the Great Beast once again managed to escape. And to make matters worse, the planet had been devastated, to the point where much of its industrial capabilities, the very capabilities that made it so important a planet, had been leveled with the ground. Whether or not Armageddon will receive the necessary aid to rise once again is unclear. As for the casualties, they undoubtedly stretch well into the billions on both sides. The Orcs, however, came out of it slightly worse. With the failure of the capture of Armageddon, the main thrust of the Orc invasion into the Armageddon sector had been shattered. This allowed the Imperial Navy to start dispatching reinforcements to other threatened planets within the Armageddon system. This meant that the wider Orc invasion was quickly halted and also eventually destroyed. These other Orcs did not have the benefit of Gasguls' direct command. They had struck the Armageddon sector with such force because the Imperial Navy had to tie itself to Armageddon Prime. Now that they no longer had to do this, they were free to roam the rest of the system, picking off the much smaller Orc fleets and delivering Imperial Guard reinforcements to the planets already under siege. Gasgul Mag Uruk's Thrakas Orc Empire in the Armageddon sector had been strangled in its infancy, and with the hero of Hellsreach, Commissar Yarick, and the Black Templars pursuing him once again, he is unlikely to be able to re-establish any footing in the Armageddon sector. This does not, however, mean that he will not be able to escape and set up a brand new Orc Empire somewhere else. The Imperium has likely not seen the last of the Beast of Armageddon. And here we are. This was the end of my video series on the second Orc invasion of Armageddon. I do hope you've enjoyed it so far, and we've got one last little video left to do. I wonder who that will feature. A certain Red Angel, perhaps. Don't expect a super long video on that though, because we have relatively little information about that particular engagement, and you may thank His Imperial Inquisition for that. They apparently don't like that kind of information spreading for some mysterious reason. Anyways, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.